At dawn, frost sealed the gravel pullout as a deputy noticed a car door ajar, engine cold, keys missing, and a handbag untouched on the seat, breath fogging the air while winter traffic hissed past, each detail tightening the sense that something had ended nearby, quietly, before anyone understood it. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Wyoming in December carried a particular stillness at the turn of the millennium, a high plains quiet broken only by wind, and the long-haul trucks threading interstate corridors between towns that trusted one another. In 2000, the state felt older than its years, governed by routine, courthouse calendars, and the patient habits of men who had learned to read weather before words. When the abandoned vehicle was logged, the county records clerk noted the date without ceremony, marking another winter entry amid livestock disputes and holiday traffic stops. The owner was identified within hours as Emily Renaud, age 22, a community college student who worked part-time at a pharmacy and drove home for Thanksgiving dinners with a reliability her parents depended upon. Her name was typed cleanly, her address verified, her height and hair color entered with practiced accuracy. Nothing in the early paperwork suggested urgency beyond the standard language used when a young adult failed to appear. The snow fell lightly that week, dusting the roads and erasing footprints, the first small theft of information in a case that would wait. Emily's last confirmed movements were methodical and ordinary. She purchased groceries on December 20th, a receipt preserved later by a cashier who remembered the weather more than the face. She mailed a card, stamped with a reindeer, to an aunt in Riverton. She clocked out at the pharmacy early on Christmas Eve, the store closing at dusk to allow employees to travel. Her car was seen on a county road that cut past a frozen reservoir, a shortcut locals used when the highway backed up. By Christmas morning, the Pullout discovery had already begun to circulate, reported in brief lines by the local paper, careful not to alarm but unable to ignore the season. Missing person flyers were printed on pale yellow stock and taped to gas station windows beside notices for church suppers and lost dogs. The language remained hopeful, as it often did at the start, and the sheriff's office followed protocol, canvassing the area, logging tips, and waiting for something concrete. The initial search unfolded with procedural restraint. Deputies mapped the radius, checked ditches, and walked the windbreaks where snow drifted deep. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing that violated the unspoken rule of Wyoming winters, that the land would show you what it took if you looked long enough. Volunteers arrived with thermoses, older men in canvas coats who knew how quickly exposure could turn a bad decision fatal. The temperature dipped below zero on Christmas night, and the search was suspended at dark, not from indifference but from experience. In the office, a file was opened, its manila cover stamped and dated, then placed on a shelf where other unfinished winters rested. Emily Renaud remained missing as the year ended, as fireworks cracked over towns that preferred church bells, and as New Year's resolutions were made with quiet sincerity. January brought interviews and the slow discipline of elimination. Friends were questioned, schedules reconstructed, phone records requested. Emily's life, small and carefully kept, offered little drama. She had no history of running away, no debts, no conflicts that could explain disappearance. The autopsy that would later define the case did not yet exist, and investigators focused on what could be proven. Tire tracks near the Pullout were photographed, measured, and compared to known vehicles. The handbag yielded a driver's license, a folded receipt, lip balm, nothing incriminating. Weather reports were appended to the file, noting snowfall that could compromise evidence. The local press returned to the story after Thanksgiving passed again in 2001, then Christmas, each year repeating the same facts with diminishing column inches. A reward fund was mentioned once, then forgotten. Men who read the paper in diners nodded and turned the page. The case aged quietly. Deputies retired. A new sheriff took office and reviewed cold files as a matter of pride, not expectation. Emily's parents moved closer to town. Hopping proximity would keep her name alive in memory. In 2004, a hunter found clothing miles from the Pullout, caught in sagebrush where the wind had carried it. The discovery shifted the case from missing to homicide with formal language, though the manner of death remained undetermined pending recovery. Forensic technicians collected fibers and photographed the scene with the same care they would have given a fresh crime, aware that time punishes imprecision. The clothing matched Emily's last known outfit, confirmed by family photographs taken the previous Thanksgiving, and the file grew heavier. Years later, advances in forensic processing offered a second look. Soil samples were reanalyzed, trace evidence re-examined. A partial DNA profile was developed from material preserved against expectations by cold and dryness. It was entered into national databases and returned no immediate hits, but it changed the posture of the investigation. The case was no longer only about patience. It was about linkage. Investigators revisited witness statements from 2000, focusing on vehicles seen near the reservoir, on a man who frequented the shortcut and had offered rides in winter storms. Records showed minor offenses, traffic stops, a pattern of presence that had seemed unremarkable at the time. In 2018, a familial search produced a distant association, a legal and ethical step taken carefully and documented thoroughly. The name that emerged was not a stranger to the county, just a man who had blended into the background of seasons. The arrest in 2020 surprised a community that had learned to live with unanswered questions. Evidence was presented without flourish. DNA consistency, timeline alignment, opportunity supported by employment records, corroboration from old tips now understood. The suspect was charged lawfully, the case argued with restraint, and a jury returned a verdict grounded in facts that had waited 2 decades. Emily Renaud's remains were finally recovered, allowing an autopsy that confirmed cause without spectacle. The legal outcome brought a sentence and a quiet aftermath. The paper printed a final article in December, nodding closure amid snow and wreaths. In Wyoming, winter returned as it always does, indifferent but exacting, and the file was closed with a date at last. Winter records have a way of flattening emotion, and the Wyoming file reflected that discipline as the years progressed. After the clothing recovery in 2004, the classification changed, triggering standardized notifications to state investigators and the Attorney General's office. The procedural shift mattered. Funding lines opened for lab work. Evidence lockers were inventoried. Photographs were rescanned to higher resolution. The geography of the case was remapped with contemporary tools, accounting for drainage patterns, prevailing winds, and the routes hunters favored in late season. Each adjustment acknowledged time without surrendering to it. Emily Renaud's background was reconstructed with the same neutrality afforded any victim. She had been raised between Casper and smaller towns, where winter driving was learned early and trust traveled faster than rumor. She kept a checking account with modest balances, paid her tuition in installments, and volunteered at a holiday food drive the week before she disappeared. Investigators confirmed no history of substance abuse, no recent conflicts, no intimate partner disputes recorded by local police. Her routines were consistent, which narrowed opportunity but expanded uncertainty. Stability, in cases like this, can conceal danger rather than exclude it. The car remained central. Technicians reviewed impound photographs, noting the absence of forced entry, the position of the seat, the angle of the wheels. A faint smear on the exterior door handle had tested negative in 2000, but re-examination decades later with improved sensitivity produced usable material. Chain of custody documentation was scrutinized line by line to ensure admissibility. The winter cold that once erased footprints had also slowed degradation, a rare benefit acknowledged quietly in reports. The vehicle's odometer reading aligned with a detour consistent with local shortcuts, reinforcing the theory that Emily had not intended to stop where the car was found. Witness accounts were reweighted. In 2000, a truck had been noted idling near the reservoir pullout during a snow squall. The description was vague, common to the region, and dismissed at the time. Later analysis placed the sighting within a tighter window when traffic thinned for Christmas Eve closures. Employment records from nearby worksites were cross-referenced. One name surfaced repeatedly in peripheral contexts, a man whose shifts ended near dusk and whose route home passed the shortcut. His presence had been ordinary enough to escape attention, which is often how long cases persist. Media coverage remained restrained, reflecting local norms. Annual pieces appeared around Thanksgiving, reminding readers of the unresolved loss without dramatization. Photographs showed Emily smiling in seasonal sweaters, an image that aged as the audience did. Tips arrived sporadically, most echoing earlier claims, some introducing new locations that were logged and assessed. The sheriff's office maintained a ledger of contacts, aware that memory can sharpen or blur with time. Each call was treated with courtesy and documented, even when it led nowhere. In 2010, the case benefited from a statewide cold case review. Files were digitized, and a small team applied fresh eyes. They focused on timelines that intersected with holidays, recognizing that altered schedules create openings. Credit card inactivity after December 20th was confirmed. Cell tower data from the era was limited, but billing records indicated a final ping consistent with the county road corridor. Weather logs confirmed wind direction that could have carried lightweight items into the sagebrush where clothing was later found. These correlations were incremental, not dramatic, but they accumulated. The decision to pursue familial DNA searching was made cautiously in 2017, following policy updates and legal consultation. Investigators prepared affidavits detailing necessity and scope. The resulting association did not identify a suspect directly, but narrowed the field to a lineage present in the county during 2000. Genealogical work traced branches through public records, obituaries, and property filings, a painstaking process conducted under supervision. One individual stood out by proximity, history of traffic stops on the shortcut road, and a pattern of seasonal employment that placed him near the area during holidays. Surveillance was limited and lawful. Investigators reviewed social media presence, which revealed little, and obtained consent-based samples where appropriate. A discarded item collected in public space provided a comparison profile. Laboratory results indicated a strong consistency with the material recovered from the car. The finding did not conclude the case, but it justified further steps. A warrant was sought and granted for a more comprehensive collection, executed without incident. The suspect cooperated, and his statements were recorded, evaluated, and set aside pending corroboration. Search efforts resumed in targeted zones informed by modeling. Cadaver dogs trained for cold environments were deployed during a narrow window when snowmelt exposed ground without saturating it. In late spring, remains were located in a shallow depression shielded by terrain, an area previously inaccessible due to snowpack. Recovery followed protocol, with a forensic anthropologist present. The site yielded personal effects consistent with Emily Renaud, confirmed by dental records and later by DNA. The recovery transformed speculation into evidence. The autopsy was conducted with restraint and precision. Findings established cause and manner without sensational detail, noting injuries consistent with environmental exposure following an unlawful act. Time since death aligned with disappearance. Trace analysis connected fibers from the suspect's vehicle to clothing recovered earlier, strengthening linkage. Each conclusion was supported by documentation and peer review, anticipating scrutiny. The case, once diffuse, began to converge. Charges were filed after review by the district attorney, who evaluated sufficiency and venue. The arrest occurred in December, a timing not chosen for effect but unavoidable given procedural readiness. The community reaction was subdued, characterized by surprise rather than outrage. Court records show a methodical progression: arraignment, motions, evidentiary hearings. Defense challenges focused on time and contamination. Arguments addressed through meticulous chain of custody and expert testimony. The winter calendar turned again as the case moved toward trial, and the narrative that had lingered for 20 years entered a final, accountable phase. Trial preparation emphasized restraint. Investigators avoided embellishment, relying instead on records that spoke through dates, signatures, and measurements. Jurors were selected with attention to familiarity and fairness, acknowledging a small community's overlapping histories. Exhibits included maps annotated with weather data, employment rosters, and lab reports explained in plain terms. The objective was clarity, not persuasion through emotion. Emily's age at death was stated once and then treated as a fact, not a device. The prosecution outlined a sequence anchored to December patterns, demonstrating how holiday schedules altered traffic and supervision. The defense examined alternate explanations, proposing coincidence and degradation, but the cumulative record resisted fragmentation. Expert witnesses addressed DNA methodology as it existed in 2000 and as it stands now, bridging the gap with education rather than authority. The judge ruled on admissibility with written findings, creating a record designed to endure. As testimony progressed, the courtroom maintained a steady cadence. The absence of theatrics underscored the gravity of delayed justice. When deliberations began, they extended across a winter weekend marked by snow advisories and quiet streets. The verdict arrived without spectacle. Guilt was found on counts supported by evidence, and acquittal entered where proof did not reach the required threshold. Sentencing followed statutory guidance, with consideration of time elapsed and harm sustained. The final legal outcome imposed a lengthy term of imprisonment, recorded in the same courthouse that had filed the original missing person report. Appeals were noted and denied in due course, the opinions citing procedural rigor. Emily Renaud's parents attended the conclusion and departed without comment, their presence acknowledged but not emphasized. Closure, in the official sense, was achieved. Afterward, the sheriff's office archived the file with annotations reflecting lessons learned. Training materials incorporated the case to illustrate patience, preservation, and the value of revisiting assumptions. The local paper published a year-end summary, placing the resolution beside weather statistics and crop reports. Life continued as it does, shaped by seasons. On Christmas Eve following sentencing, candles appeared briefly near the reservoir pullout, placed by hands that did not linger. Snow covered them by morning. In Wyoming, remembrance often takes that form, understated and durable. The road remained open, traffic passing without pause, while records inside a warm building preserved the account. The case rested, solved, its facts fixed, its echoes confined to archives and the quiet knowledge that method, sustained over time, can answer even the coldest questions. The aftermath settled into routine acknowledgments. Memorial scholarships were discussed and declined, privacy preferred. Investigators returned equipment and closed warrants, not in compliance. Evidence was retained per statute, labeled and sealed. Annual audits confirmed status without reopening wounds. In interviews years later, officials spoke of discipline, not triumph. The winter calendar kept its rhythm, with Thanksgiving columns giving way to Christmas notices and New Year reflections. Emily Renaud's name appeared once more, then less often, integrated into institutional memory. For the men who had carried the file through decades, resolution meant restraint. They understood that success here was measured not by noise, but by accuracy maintained until time allowed proof to surface. The county returned to work, roads cleared, ledgers balanced, and winter moved on, impartial and complete, documented officially. In the months following the verdict, the institutional response was deliberate and quiet. Court transcripts were certified and stored, evidence logs reconciled against statutory retention schedules, and a final report was submitted to the state's cold case registry, noting resolution after 20 years. The language avoided celebration. It emphasized compliance, verification, and closure obtained through lawful means. For the men who had worked the case in its final phase, many already nearing retirement, the paperwork mattered as much as the arrest had. A solved case is only complete when it survives review. Emily Renaud's remains were released to her family under standard protocols. A private burial took place after the ground thawed enough to allow excavation, a practical detail that reflected the region more than sentiment. No public service was announced. The local paper ran a single notice acknowledging interment and asking for privacy. Those who noticed understood. In Wyoming, restraint often signals respect more clearly than display. The investigation itself became a reference point inside law enforcement circles, not because of novelty, but because of endurance. Training sessions cited the preservation of the vehicle evidence, the decision to re-examine early assumptions, and the disciplined use of evolving forensic tools. Younger deputies listened to supervisors describe the importance of maintaining chain of custody even when a case appears dormant. The lesson was simple and unadorned. Winters pass. Evidence remains if it is guarded correctly. Community reaction remained measured. There were no demonstrations, no televised appeals. The arrest had shocked the town precisely because it contradicted the assumption that time erases responsibility. The suspect had been known in passing, not as a public figure, but as a man who occupied familiar spaces without distinction. That ordinariness unsettled some residents more than the crime itself. Conversations in cafes returned to weather and ranch prices within days. Stability reasserted itself, as it often does in places where routine is valued. The courthouse where sentencing occurred returned to its calendar of property disputes, probate hearings, and seasonal traffic cases. Clerks filed documents with the same impartial efficiency they always had. The bench issued a written sentencing order citing statutory factors and precedent, ensuring the decision would withstand appellate scrutiny. When the appeal was denied, the order was amended to reflect finality. The process closed without flourish. From a forensic standpoint, the case underscored how environmental conditions can both obscure and preserve. The cold that erased immediate traces also slowed decay, allowing later analysis to succeed. Investigators documented this duality in internal memoranda, careful to avoid extrapolation beyond the facts. The methodology was emphasized over the outcome. In cold regions, patience is not passive. It is a technique. Emily Renaud's life was summarized in official documents with brevity. Age at death, 22. Occupation, student pharmacy assistant. Residence, Natrona County. Those facts appeared in multiple places, unchanging as the years advanced. Her parents' statements were included once, then referenced rather than repeated to minimize intrusion. The focus remained on verifiable actions, dates, and findings. The suspect's background was likewise reduced to records. Employment histories, vehicle registrations, traffic citations, and addresses were compiled and cross-checked. The narrative avoided speculation about motive beyond what could be supported. Opportunity and linkage were sufficient. In the final accounting, simplicity carried more weight than conjecture. The case was solved not by a revelation, but by alignment. Media retrospectives appeared around Thanksgiving the year after sentencing, framed as reminders rather than features. Headlines noted resolution and the role of modern forensics. The tone mirrored earlier coverage, steady and factual. Editors avoided anniversary language that might suggest spectacle. Readers accustomed to long winters recognized the approach as appropriate. Within the sheriff's office, the physical file was boxed and labeled, its contents digitized and indexed. A notation was added directing future inquiries to a summary memorandum. The box joined others on shelves that documented decades of local history. Some cases remained open, others closed by time or circumstance. This one now rested in the latter category, complete. The quiet aftermath extended to the site where the vehicle had been found. No marker was installed. The pullout remained a practical place for drivers to check loads or chains during storms. Those who knew the history sometimes slowed as they passed, but traffic did not change. The land absorbed the memory without instruction. For investigators who had inherited the case, resolution brought a subdued sense of completion. There were no speeches. A brief acknowledgement was offered at a staff meeting, recognizing adherence to procedure across administrations. The emphasis remained on continuity. One sheriff noted that the outcome belonged to the institution rather than individuals. The remark was recorded in minutes and moved on from. From a legal perspective, the case demonstrated the viability of delayed prosecution when supported by preserved evidence and methodical review. Law review commentary referenced the decision in discussions of familial DNA searches, noting the careful compliance with evolving standards. The opinion denying appeal was cited for its clarity on admissibility and chain of custody. The case entered the literature without fanfare. Emily's parents relocated again after the burial, choosing a smaller town where winters were no less severe but familiarity offered comfort. They declined interviews. Their decision was respected. In public records, their address changed and correspondence from the court ceased. Grief, in such contexts, becomes private by necessity. As seasons continued, the county experienced the usual cycles. Thanksgiving brought cautious travel advisories. Christmas Eve stores closed early. New Year's arrived without incident. The rhythms that framed Emily Renaud's disappearance now framed its resolution, completing a calendar that had been interrupted 2 decades earlier. The investigation's final report concluded with recommendations rather than reflections. It advised periodic review of dormant cases, investment in evidence preservation, and training in evolving forensic methods. It noted the importance of local knowledge paired with external expertise. The language was practical, not poetic. Years later, when asked informally about the case, one investigator summarized it with characteristic restraint. Time did not solve it. Work did. The comment did not appear in any official document, but it captured the ethos that guided the process. The town adjusted. Younger residents learned of the case as history rather than current concern. Older men, the intended audience of the newspaper columns that chronicled the story, recognized the familiar pattern of patience rewarded. They had lived long enough to know that not all winters end quickly, and that some accounts require decades to balance. Emily Renaud's name remained in the archives, attached now to a conclusion rather than a question. The resolution did not restore what was lost, but it clarified what happened and who was responsible. In the measured language of the law, that clarity mattered. As another December settled over Wyoming, snow lining roads and courthouse steps, the community moved forward without ceremony. The case, solved at last, receded into the background of recorded history, where facts endure quietly, waiting for those who choose to read them. The final chapter of the Wyoming 2000 case settled into record books without ceremony, the way most truths eventually do when stripped of urgency and returned to order. After the appellate window closed, the sentence stood unchanged, affirmed through written opinions that emphasized evidence integrity and procedural patience. The defendant was transferred to a state facility farther south, his intake logged, his identification number entered, his movement removed from local notice. The system absorbed him as it was designed to do, without comment or deviation, and the case ceased to generate paperwork. For the county, resolution meant recalibration rather than relief. Administrators reviewed staffing notes from earlier years and acknowledged gaps that time had exposed. Budget requests for evidence storage were revised, not because of this case alone, but because it illustrated a principle long understood by older investigators. Preservation is not passive. It requires attention during quiet years when nothing appears to be happening. The sheriff's office secured modest funding for climate-controlled lockers, a practical investment justified by experience rather than tragedy. Emily Renaud's file became part of onboarding instruction. New deputies learned her name alongside dates and protocols, not as a warning but as an example of continuity. They were told how an abandoned car on a frozen morning can remain relevant decades later if documented correctly. They were shown copies of early reports, typed on aging forms, and the later lab results that relied on them. The message was consistent. Every entry matters, even when the outcome is not visible. The community's memory of Emily shifted subtly after resolution. Before, her name had carried uncertainty, a question mark repeated each winter. Afterward, it carried a conclusion. That change mattered to people who had lived through the years of not knowing. In conversations that avoided sentiment, residents acknowledged that answers, even delayed ones, stabilize a place. Unresolved cases create a low, constant pressure. Resolution releases it quietly. Local journalists revisited their archives and corrected language in digital versions, updating missing person references to reflect the verdict. Editors added brief notes clarifying the outcome, careful to preserve original reporting while ensuring accuracy. The practice reflected professional discipline rather than nostalgia. The story was no longer unfolding. It had finished. The site where Emily's remains were recovered returned to anonymity. Wind flattened grasses. Snow covered shallow impressions. No fence or sign marked the ground. Investigators agreed unanimously that nothing should. The land did not require annotation. Its role had been documented and concluded. Preservation here meant restraint. Forensic specialists involved in the case presented at regional conferences, discussing technical aspects without nomming the town. They spoke about cold climate preservation, delayed DNA viability, and the importance of retaining even marginal samples. The audience understood the context without embellishment. The presentation ended with recommendations, not applause. Emily's family maintained distance from public discussion. They received official notification when all proceedings ended, a single letter confirming finality. No request for statement followed. Their grief had already endured enough administrative attention. Closure, for them, occurred outside institutional language, in private decisions and routines not recorded anywhere. In the years that followed, the case occasionally surfaced during policy debates about genetic searching. Legal scholars cited it for its compliance rather than its outcome. The method had been careful, incremental, and documented. That mattered more than the length of the sentence imposed. The justice system values process because process endures when memory fades. Seasonal cycles continued to frame how the story was remembered. Thanksgiving editorials sometimes reference the case obliquely as an example of patience rewarded. Christmas issues mentioned it less frequently, perhaps because absence resonates more strongly during holidays. New Year reflections favored forward-looking themes. The calendar absorbed the narrative and redistributed it across time. For the men who had followed the case from the beginning, resolution arrived as a recognition of limits. No verdict restores a life interrupted. No sentence returns lost years. What the law can do is establish truth within standards that protect everyone involved. That outcome, achieved here, was sufficient. The courthouse itself remained unchanged. Stone steps weathered. Files accumulated. Clerks rotated. The room where sentencing occurred hosted routine hearings weeks later, voices low, calendars full. Institutional memory does not linger on individual cases. It relies on structure, repetition, and continuity. Emily Renaud's name now appears in state statistics as a resolved homicide, cleared by arrest and conviction. The classification carries no emotion, only confirmation. For analysts reviewing trends, the case contributes a data point about clearance rates and cold case viability. Numbers flatten stories, but they also ensure inclusion. Emily is counted. Years after the arrest, a deputy passing the reservoir pullout during a winter patrol slowed briefly, not out of duty but habit. The road was clear. Visibility was good. Nothing required attention. He continued on, radio silent. That moment, unremarkable by design, reflected what resolution ultimately provides: normalcy restored. The Wyoming 2000 cold case did not end with revelation or spectacle. It ended with paperwork completed, evidence secured, and a verdict upheld. Its significance lies in the demonstration that time, while eroding memory, does not dissolve responsibility when institutions maintain discipline. The quiet aftermath confirmed that principle. As another decade approaches, the file remains accessible, its lessons intact. New technologies will emerge. Standards will evolve. Future investigators may read the reports and see methods already outdated. They will also see consistency. The fundamentals do not change. Emily Renaud lived 22 years. Her death interrupted a predictable path defined by work, study, and seasonal routines. The investigation that followed extended far longer, shaped by the same environment that had framed her life. Winter delayed answers. Persistence recovered them. The final record contains no dramatic language. It does not need it. Facts arranged carefully are sufficient. A car abandoned in frost. Evidence preserved. Time passed. Evidence spoke. Accountability followed. In Wyoming, where distance and weather teach patience, that sequence resonates. The case stands as proof that even in silence, work continues. Even in cold, preservation matters. Even after years, truth can be assembled piece by piece, without noise, without haste, until it is complete.